Hey, folks. So today's lecture is going to focus on the Middle East and the puzzle of why is it that this particular region of the world is so unstable, that both politically unstable within governments. We've seen a great deal of civil conflict, and also it's been a region that has featured perhaps more than any other in the last 70 years conflicts, interstate wars among countries, as well as uh, intervention by outside great powers. So, if we see an overall trend toward a more peaceful world, the Middle East is somewhat of an exception. Here's a map of the Middle East. It shows, you can see here, um, the two big countries, and geographically and also politically, are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Egypt is a traditional center of the Arab world in terms of culture and politics, but it has become less central as its economy has fallen behind some of the large oil producing countries. Um, Iraq, of course, is a country that the United States has been involved with for many years now in terms of two wars there. First in 1991, and then again in 2003, up until for over a decade, actually. Syria is a country where we've had recent conflicts, and Turkey's another major power in the area. Afghanistan is off here to the right, bordering on Iran. Um, but let's look at the when I say that it's a region that's marked by a great deal of conflict. Let's look at just a few highlights, and we're not obviously going to be able to go into these in any significant detail, but I just want to paint this picture of a region racked by instability. So, of course, a major source of conflict within the Middle East has been that between Israel and its Arab neighbors, since Israel was formed in 1948 out of the British Mandate. Um, you can see that there have been multiple wars here: 48, 56, 67, 73, 81. And those are just the major wars between Israel and its neighboring countries. It doesn't include the many conflicts which there have been terrorism, there's been Israeli strikes into the West Bank or Gaza or Lebanon to deal with rocket attacks or to deal with terrorist incidents. And so, uh, um, and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, who uh, make up the majority of the population of the West Bank and Gaza, to areas that are occupied by Israel and have been since 1967. Um, that conflict has been ongoing and it's unresolved. Um, so Israel and its Arab neighbors have been in conflict for a long time, and of course Israel is a close ally of the United States. So the U.S. has been involved in trying to make peace as well as supporting Israel. Um, Iran in 1979, there was a revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran, who was a close American ally, replaced it with an Islamic regime headed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And there was, in fact, um, the U.S. embassy was taken over by young Iranians who held the much of the staff there hostage for almost a year in 1979, and so that set in motion a ongoing conflictual relationship between Iran and the United States that, in most recent years, focuses on Iran's nuclear program as well as its influence in other parts of the Middle East. Then we have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. That led to a decade-long conflict. The U.S. supporting Islamic groups out of Pakistan, through Pakistan against the Soviet occupiers. And then after the Soviets finally withdrew and their puppet government fell, there was a period of anarchy followed by the rise of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, a more militant Islamic group, and which allowed Al Qaeda to have to enter the country and operate from there, which led to the 9/11 attacks, which led to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and its continuing presence there, almost 2 decades later. And then we have in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War, which led to about 1 million casualties, an 8-year conflict between these two countries. In 1991, as I mentioned, the United States went to war against Iraq to try to force troops out of Kuwait. The previous year, Iraq had invaded its neighbor Kuwait, which you can see here on this little piece of land here between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. So the U.S. led a coalition of forces that pushed out Iraqi troops from Kuwait. I mentioned already the 9/11 attacks, Al Qaeda, a terrorist group attacking the U.S. soil, led to a war on terror that in some ways is still ongoing. Then there was the Sunni awakening the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Sunni awakening in Iraq in 2007, where forces that had been fighting against the Shiite government and against the U.S. forces turned around and, joined with the U.S. in fighting instead against an Al Qaeda-supported group. 2010, you had the Arab revolutions, so-called Arab Spring, for democracy in the Middle East, and almost everywhere except Tunisia, those movements were put down either immediately or over time, and in some places led to ongoing conflict, especially in Syria. Then you had the Syrian uprising, as I mentioned, in 2011, an outcome of the Arab Spring civil war, which created space for the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS, which at one point controlled about a third of Iraq as well as a large portion of Syria. Now it's been almost entirely defeated in Syria, although it still has branches around the world. 2015, the war in Yemen, pitting two factions against one another, one aligned with Iran, the other with Saudi Arabia. And then finally in 2019, the Turkish invasion of Syria aimed at removing Kurdish forces from the Turkish border that the Turks considered a threat. So all of this is very complex, obviously, but it paints the overall picture, which is a violent one. So why so much instability in the Middle East? Well, each conflict, of course, has its own distinctive sources, but let's look at the broader underlying factors that make this such a unstable region. First of all, the borders, the states that were formed in the Middle East, for the most part, were carved out of the Ottoman Empire, which eventually transformed into the modern-day form as the Turkish state. But Turkey once controlled much of the Balkans, much of what we call the Middle East, North Africa, even at one point up into Spain, the Moors who controlled Spain for a time. So Ottoman Empire was one of the major empires in world history, and but in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was a weakening empire that was gradually shedding pieces as groups rebelled and broke off from the empire, and as other great powers were encouraging these kind of revolts. Um, After World War I, as we'll talk more about later, the European powers, Britain and France in particular, carved up the Middle East as the Ottomans were, lost control of the region, and that led to the creation of these newly formed states, now only about a century old. So they're brand new states that were formed around artificial borders, and so they didn't correspond to any natural groupings of peoples or cultures and or political identity. And so the governments there have struggled to try to create a sense of common nationhood, and their difficulty in doing that has been one of the sources of instability. A second is that, at least in some parts of the Middle East, there's a great deal of diversity, which has been a source of conflict. Some of this is tribal, some is built around ethnicity, religious diversity, which we'll talk about. A third element is the prevalence of resource states that depend upon oil for most of their revenue. And we'll talk about why it is that resource states seldom feature democratic government. It's very difficult for democracy to take root in countries that are dependent upon one major resource like oil. And so that leads to the next point. If the democratic peace theory has any validity, then the absence of democracy in most of the Middle East is perhaps one source of instability and conflict. There's no mutual democratic glue that holds countries together. Low levels of interdependence. Countries export and import from the rest of the world, but not to one another within the region. And that if liberals are right that interdependence among countries leads to mutual benefit and therefore peace, the lack of interdependence within the Arab world itself, within the Middle East, is a source of instability. High levels of external intervention by other great powers, particularly in the earlier years, European powers, later years, the United States and particularly the Soviet Union, and increasingly China, as not so much in military terms, but in political and economic terms, China's role in the region is starting to emerge. The fact that, unlike in say in the Americas or in China's role it plays in Asia, there's no dominant hegemon. There's no one single country that is able to establish peace in the region. Instead, it's a kind of multipolar region where a number of countries of fairly equal strength are vying for increased control. So one of the most important features of the Middle East is that it geographically sits at the intersection of three great continents, right? Africa, Europe, and Asia. And it serves as a kind of crossroads between the cultures and also economically between these areas. And so one of the things that we find is that over time, great empires have risen and fallen that have intruded upon the Middle East from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, within the Middle East itself. And so it is a region that is marked by the residues of all of these past imperial history. So let's look at a YouTube video that focuses on this history. So let's play it. So this shows we start with the kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, modern day Turkey, the kingdom of Israel, those all rising from within the region itself. We're moving chronologically forward: the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, ancient times, and then the Persian Empire, which was one of the greatest empires of historically, Macedonian Empire, the Roman Empire, which controlled much of the Middle East and North Africa at a time, the Byzantine Empire, which sort of broke off from the Roman Empire, the Sassanid Empire, again rising from Iran, the Caliphate, religious empire with an Islamic base. Here's the Crusaders from Christian Europe that invaded the Middle East, thrown out by Saladin and his empire. Then you had the Mongols who controlled much of Eurasia, really, followed by the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for hundreds of years. European colonial empires then, especially after World War I, and then finally you had the emergence of modern nation states, and including the founding of the State of Israel. Those are you can see the dates of independence, which range from the 1920s through to the 1970s, some of the more recent period. So in that sense, we have then a picture of a region that has had many different cultural influences, political forms over time. You can think of it as a kind of geological dig. If you dig down, you see layers, civilizational layers built on top of one another that have all left some influence on the culture of the region and its sense of identity and history. So that makes for a very complex environment for the creation of modern nation states. Now, this shows a treaty in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Treaty that was between Great Britain and France, and included as a kind of, to some degree, Russia was involved later. And basically what happened, and this is very little known in the United States, but it's taught in the Middle East in schools, and it's a major point of grievance, really, against the Western powers, especially in the Arab world. And so what happened here is that the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in the First World War. And so it was able to provide, oil from the Middle East that helped the Germans and the Austrians who were fighting against Russia and Great Britain and France, and later on the United States itself. And so especially there was a strong interest on the part of the Allied side to cut off the source of oil and raw materials from the Middle East. And so Britain and France sought to encourage local revolts against the Ottomans. There were Arab groups, tribes that had long wanted to have more independence from the Ottomans, who kind of chafed against Ottoman rule, especially in the Saudi family, which dominated the politics of the Arabian Peninsula, what we now call Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis were persuaded by the British to basically rise up against the Ottomans and to be provided with weapons and intelligence by the British and some other minor military support. If they would rise up against the Ottomans, of course, this was a risky thing to do. And in return for this, the Saudis were promised that they would be able to that the Arabs would gain their independence after the war. Once the Ottomans had been kicked out, the Arabs would be able to run their own states and their own affairs. So that, in fact, happened. If you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, Lawrence's role is mightily hyped and overhyped in that movie. He played a minor role, actually, in the uprising, but he was there and served as a kind of liaison to the Arab forces that were fighting the Ottomans. However, the Sykes-Picot Treaty in 1916 was a secret agreement that was only revealed once the Bolsheviks had gained power in Russia. They published all these secret treaties that they were party to or aware of, and so it became public. This Sykes-Picot Treaty, but it was really a betrayal of the promises that were made to the Saudis. And it outlined an area, as you can see, this blue area of French control and orange area of British control. And then they outlined areas that were to be nominally independent Arab states, but that were, in fact, to be within what they called a French or British sphere of influence. And the British were to retain control over, to have international League of Nations mandate over the international control, British control over the what is now parts of Jordan and Israel. So this served as the basis for the League of Nations mandate in 1920. So the League of Nations basically said, we're going to go beyond the old colonial style, but it's basically recreating a kind of temporary colonialism in that the League of Nations said countries, Britain and France, will have mandates over portions of the Middle East where the Ottomans have retreated. They will their mandate is that they will govern these areas, but they're supposed to prepare the local population to eventually have independence. Now, there was no timetable set for independence, and in point of fact, it was not that different from the old colonialism. And so you can see here that much of modern-day Syria was given to the French, as well as Lebanon. Jordan and Iraq were placed under British control, and the Saudis did in 1932 were given independence. Nevertheless, those regions had been promised to the Arabs as independent, and that promise was not kept. So you can see that roughly the borders of the mandates became the borders of the countries that eventually emerged as independent states. Now this is another feature of the Middle East, is at least in some portions, the diversity. So this shows the ethnic distribution of different ethnic groups, and you can see how many there are. There are lots of different colors here on this map, especially Iran, Afghanistan, Turkey, the northern parts of Syria and Iraq, as well as Lebanon, are just filled with a variety of different groups. The Kurds are a good example of some of these problems, right? That the Kurds are a very old and distinctive ethnic group that has its own language, its own culture and history that's distinct from the Arabs that are dominant in the Middle East. And the Kurds have since the 1920s demanded to have their own state, Kurdistan. And in fact, there was at one point a plan to create a Kurdistan that was later abandoned. Instead, the Kurds are spread across 5 different countries, including Turkey and Syria and Iraq, so that they are basically a stateless nation. And within each of these countries, including Iran, I didn't mention, but Iran's an important player here as well. In each of these countries, the central governments who represent the dominant ethnic group consider the Kurds to be a danger, that they are separatists, that they are threatened to divide and the country and to geographically split off. There's especially fear of the idea of the different pieces of each country that have Kurdish concentrations, that they might come together and form a separate state that would be destabilizing. So the Kurds are treated with repression in the countries where they live. And on a much smaller scale, you get similar kind of issues in many of these other countries. Now, in the heart of the Middle East, you have predominantly Arab-speaking peoples, but even there, if we got down to a more fine-grained analysis, within those there are tribal structures built around clans and lineage groups that are led by local sheiks or other, leaders, and feud with one another and over control of territory and resources and political power. So and then there finally is the religious differences, which we'll come to. Another feature of the Middle East is that it's kind of cursed with lots of oil. We call this a resource curse because oil would seem to be a good thing, right? That you can sell oil, and if you have a lot of oil, you sell it, you make money, you become wealthy. And some countries, especially the smaller countries that have concentrated oil resources, have in fact become fabulously wealthy. These brown dots represent major oil reserves in the Middle East. You can see they're concentrated in what's called the Persian Gulf area here. And then you have oil up here in Syria and Iraq, and smaller amounts here in Egypt. But the main fields here are in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and then the Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman. Those are the main oil resource countries in the region. You can see Qatar is almost $100,000 per person of annual income. By regional standards, Kuwait and the UAE are also quite wealthy. Saudi Arabia is a little bit less wealthy, but that wealth is concentrated in a few hands. So you can find, if you go to major cities in Saudi Arabia, it appears to be quite wealthy. But there also is a large number of, especially immigrants from Pakistan or from Palestinians who are basically laborers and don't have citizenship and are living in much poorer circumstances. You can see Iran has a lot of oil, but it also has a big population, and so spread across that population, the income level is still quite low. Same thing in Iraq. Now, why is it that oil is called a resource curse? Well, the reason is that oil then becomes a focal point for political competition. The oil reserves are controlled by the state, and the state then, since the early 70s, when the Western oil companies were nationalized, their assets were nationalized, governments and government-controlled corporations took control in the Middle East. Since that time, basically, if you control the government, if you control the state, then you control the oil. If you control the oil, then you control the revenues that come from exporting that oil. Very little of the oil is sold, well, some is sold locally, but most of the revenues come from the exports, not the local sales, which are often heavily subsidized. So if you control the state, you have the spigot to great wealth. And notice that oil production is capital intensive, it's not labor intensive. So you really don't need a lot of workers in the oil industry to generate those export revenues. Therefore, from the ruler's standpoint, the vast majority of the population is kind of superfluous to their own power and wealth. They don't depend upon that population for their wealth. They depend upon the consumers in the oil importing countries for their wealth. And therefore, they have very little incentive to invest in upgrading the skills and the education and creating a diversified economy for their population. They do have an interest in stability, and therefore they will spread around some of their oil wealth to buy off different groups within society to avoid having their power challenged. But basically, this is not very conducive to democracy because once you control the state, you don't ever want to give it up. So the idea of having a loyal opposition that, in the party system, multiple party system where the, government changes hands, well, you don't want that because if you control the state, you control everything. If you control all the sources of wealth. If you don't control the state, you have nothing except for what you occasionally handouts in order to buy off your support. So basically, it's a system that doesn't give rise to democracy. Another way to think about that is to look at a country like South Korea, which is very wealthy now. Well, South Korea started out very poor in the 1950s. It had no resources. It had no substantial resources of oil or other raw materials. Agriculture was quite poor. It's kind of a cold, mountainous place. Well, it still became wealthy. Well, its leaders basically said, look, and it had an authoritarian government, but it transitioned in the 70s to a democracy. How did that happen? Well, basically, those who are at the top realized that the only way they could become wealthy is not by controlling resources, because there weren't any, but instead by investing in a diversified economy that would create modern industrialization and thereby create wealth. And that happens only if you invest in a well-educated labor force, and you have to be willing to share some of the resulting wealth with that labor force if they are going to. In other words, you depend upon that labor force. Moreover, in order for the state to be wealthy, it has to tax resources within its own society. And those taxes only amount to much if the economy as a whole is growing. Whereas in the case of, if you're an oil-dominant economy, you don't raise money by taxing, people within your society. You raise money by siphoning money off of the oil export revenues. So in South Korea's case, the elite could only grow wealthy by making sure everybody else shared in that wealth and by creating a broad-based, diversified economy that was relatively equitable compared to many other parts of the world. But if you, in countries that have lots of oil, you get a small elite. They siphon money off of export revenues. They don't really have a need or a stake in having a broad-based economy. And the final reason why oil is a kind of resource curse is that the countries that have a lot of revenues from oil exports, their currency value rises because from those exports, and that makes it very difficult to become competitive in producing manufactured goods for export. Why? Because when your currency value is high, it means that your exports are also going to be expensive. That's good in the case of oil because you want to get more, revenues. But in the case of manufacturing, it means that you're not going to compete with other countries whose currencies are valued less. All right. Well, so resource rich countries are often, especially oil-rich countries, it often distorts their economies and distorts their politics in ways that don't allow for democracy, that create enormous inequalities within the society, and finally that make them targets for external intervention because other countries, great powers, see a strong stake in that access to that oil, and therefore they try to control and intervene and interfere in the politics of countries that control the oil. We can see here, this isn't directly a measure of democracy, but it's a measure put out by Freedom House on countries that are free, partly free, or not free. Democracy is a major component, but it also includes things like traditional civil liberties like Bill of Rights, type of things like freedom of the press, etc. And you can see here that that in the Middle East, Tunisia, Lebanon, Morocco, Libya, Kuwait are considered partly free, and there's a whole lineup of countries considered not free. And the only country that's considered free is Israel, and even Israel has serious questions about serious problems in terms of the political status of the Arab minority. What about governance? Resource states generally, again, are kind of like gas stations that for the elite, and they don't invest a great deal in public goods or in improving governance. And so you can see here, MENA is Middle East, North Africa. We look at compare to governance performance with the East Asia, Latin America, and the OECD is the rich countries. And you can see on voice and accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, almost all of these, the Middle East is at or roughly tied for the bottom measurement compared to these other regions. We mentioned that liberalism says that countries that are economically interdependent have more peace. Well, the Middle East is the least economically interdependent region in the world. You can see here that if we look at the most recent data of 2008, 2010, the light blue looks at the share of exports within the region. It's much lower than ASEAN is Southeast Asia, EU 27, that's the European Union, Mercosur is Latin America, NAFTA is North America. So in all of those cases, those regions have a much greater percentage of their exports are among countries within their region. Whereas in the case of the Middle East, their countries' exports are to other parts of the world, not to their neighbors. A major source of conflict in the Middle East is the split between the two major branches of Islam, Shia and Sunni. And even within those branches, there's a great deal of diversity and sometimes conflict. So we can see here basically Sunni Islam represents about 85% of all of Muslims in the world. Shia about 15%. But the distribution is lopsided in certain areas. So if you look at the orange areas, those are areas where there is a dominant Shia presence. The kind of darker shaded brown is where there's a mix of both Sunni and Shia. So you can see that there's a kind of a crescent, a band, a Shia band that starts in Afghanistan, moves most intensively through Iran, which is predominantly Shia, includes portions of Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and a significant presence in Turkey, parts of in Lebanon, and then the western portion of Syria. So there's kind of a band there, and then you have then you have the predominantly Sunni areas, and those are in the gray or in the dark brown, where there's a mix of Sunni and Shia. And you see here that Saudi Arabia is mostly gray, but there's a green portion. That's a particular type of Sunni religious group, which is labeled Wahhabi or Salafi. It's a more fundamentalist, so to speak, brand of Sunni Islam that's mostly limited to Saudi Arabia, but it's begun to spread in the last couple of decades in other countries as well. But you can see that Sunni Islam is dominant in Saudi Arabia, in most of Syria, in Egypt and Jordan and the West Bank. So most of the Arab world outside of Iran and the band up near Turkey. So in terms of these, there's nothing that necessarily leads to conflict between two branches of the same religion. Christianity also has, of course, Protestants and Catholics, and within each there are different sects. And there were, for many centuries, violent conflicts, religious wars within Europe. But that's not been the case for some time, except in instances like Northern Ireland. But in the case of the Middle East, what makes religion become important is that the two major powers right now are Iran and Saudi Arabia, and one is mainly a Shiite regime, and the other is a Sunni regime. They're both theocracies. They're both religious, led by religious figures, and so those two countries basically are competing for dominance in the region, and they use religion as one means to do so. And they tend to, Shias tend to rally under the banner of Iran, and Sunnis under the banner of Saudi Arabia to some extent. And a country like Iraq, which has is divided, ends up, being in conflict, internally in conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. So right now we have what appear to be religious conflicts are really more political competition for rivalry between these two major countries. And the major places where this is carrying out are Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. Syria is, I guess the most recent real hot box where there's been a lot of conflict since about 2014 or so. You can see here in the green are the mostly Kurdish in the northeastern part of Syria. They're the mostly Arab are the kind of brownish or yellowish, and then the purplish are the minority groups. These include Druze and Alawites and even some Christians. So the conflict has been really multifaceted. We won't go into this very much, but Syria became a battleground with the government of. It was originally Hafez al-Assad was the father of a dynasty that's ruled Syria for several decades. His son now, Bashir al-Assad, is in power, and he's they are considered Alawites, which are a kind of a break-off religious sect from Islam. But the conflict there has drawn in Iran, Russia, the United States, Turkey, ISIS, the Kurds, and then there are various kinds of Sunni militias, including Al-Qaeda affiliated militias. So this is a good example of how the fracturing of the Middle East along ethnic and religious lines, and the absence of democracy and the great power intervention at all, as well as oil, ends up making it very difficult to promote a stable political order. So that's a broad brush picture of why it is that the Middle East is a region of continuing conflict and often violence. Thanks.